In our home, you earned your bed each night through academic performance, or you slept on the floor. I woke up on the hardwood floor of my bedroom at 5:30 in the morning, with my spine aching and my neck stiff. The thin blanket I was allowed to use had twisted around my legs during the night, and my left arm had gone numb from being pressed against the floor for hours. My younger brother Eli was asleep in his bed across the room, the thick comforter pulled up to his chin, his pillow looking soft and inviting. He'd earned his bed last night by scoring 98 on his biology test. I'd gotten an 87 on my algebra exam, which was below the 90 threshold our parents required. So I slept on the floor. This was normal in our house. It had been normal for 3 years. Ever since I turned 11 and Dad decided we were old enough to understand that comfort was a privilege you earned through excellence. I stood up slowly, my joints cracking, and looked at my bed. The mattress sat empty, sheets pulled tight, pillows arranged neatly, mocking me. Dad had been a high school dropout who worked construction until he injured his back and had to take disability. Mom had barely graduated with a 2.1 GPA and worked retail jobs that never lasted more than a few months. They both talked constantly about how their lives would have been different if they'd been better students, if they'd worked harder, if they'd cared more about grades. They watched documentaries about successful people and noticed every single one had been a strong student. Dad would pause the video and say, "See that? Straight A student. That's the difference between success and failure." Mom would nod and add, "Education is the only thing that matters. Everything else is just excuses." So when my oldest sister, Kara, turned 10, they implemented the system. You earned your bed through academic achievement. Anything below a 90 on a test meant floor sleeping until you brought your grades back up. Missing homework assignments meant floor sleeping. Poor effort meant floor sleeping. The system was designed to motivate us, Dad said, to teach us that comfort came from hard work and excellence. Kara slept on the floor so often during her first year under the system that she developed chronic back problems by age 12. She'd wake up crying from the pain, but Dad said that just proved the system was working. She needed to try harder. She eventually learned to maintain straight A's through sheer terror of sleeping on the floor. Now she was 17 and heading to college next year with a full academic scholarship. Dad loved to tell people about Kara's success, how his parenting methods had created a brilliant daughter. He never mentioned that Kara barely spoke to any of us anymore, that she spent all her time studying in the library to avoid being home, that she developed an anxiety disorder so severe she had panic attacks before every test. My other sister, Bree, was 15 and had also learned to maintain the grades necessary to keep her bed. She studied until midnight most nights, surviving on energy drinks and sheer willpower. Eli was 12 and naturally gifted at school, so he rarely slept on the floor. Then there was me, 14 years old, struggling with math and dreading every school day. That morning, I went downstairs for breakfast and found Dad already at the kitchen table with his laptop open. He tracked all our grades through the school portal, checking multiple times per day for updated scores. He looked up when I walked in and said, "Your algebra teacher posted the exam results. 87. What happened?" I poured cereal into a bowl and said, "I studied for 3 hours. The test was just really hard." Dad closed his laptop with a sharp click. "Studying isn't about hours. It's about effectiveness. You obviously didn't study correctly if you only got an 87. That's a B+. We don't accept B+ in this house." Mom came in from the laundry room and added, "You know the rules. Excellence or consequences. It's not complicated." I sat at the table and ate my cereal in silence, while Dad explained that I'd need to retake the unit test and score at least a 95 to earn my bed back. Until then, floor sleeping. Kara came downstairs dressed for school, looking exhausted. She'd been up until 2 working on a research paper. She grabbed a granola bar and left without saying anything to anyone. At school, I couldn't focus during English class because my back hurt so much from sleeping on the floor. The teacher called on me to answer a question about the reading homework, and I stammered through a half-correct response because I'd been too tired last night to finish the chapter. After class, my friend David asked if I was okay, and I told him I just didn't sleep well. I couldn't explain the real reason. How do you tell someone that your parents make you sleep on the floor if your grades aren't perfect? It sounded insane when I tried to put it into words. David would think I was making it up or exaggerating. Everyone thought my parents were strict but well-meaning. They volunteered at school events, attended parent-teacher conferences, talked about the importance of education. From the outside, they looked like model parents who just had high standards. Nobody saw what happened behind our closed doors at home. During lunch, I sat in the library instead of the cafeteria and tried to study for my upcoming history test. I had to score at least a 90 or I'd be sleeping on the floor for another week. The material was about World War I, and I kept reading the same paragraph over and over without retaining any information. My mind was fuzzy from exhaustion and pain. I thought about Kara and how she'd mastered the system by simply never allowing herself to score below a 90 on anything ever. But Kara was naturally smarter than me. She had a photographic memory and could read something once and remember it perfectly. I had to work twice as hard to get half the results. I wasn't stupid, but I wasn't brilliant either. I was average, and in our house, average meant punishment. The bell rang for next period, and I shoved my textbook back in my bag, feeling hopeless. That night, I scored a 92 on my history test. Not great, but good enough. I'd earned my bed back for at least one night. When I got home, I showed Dad the test score on my phone, and he nodded approval. Better. That's what I expect to see consistently. I went upstairs and collapsed onto my bed, the mattress feeling like heaven after 2 nights on the floor. I set my alarm for 6 gows and passed out immediately, my body desperate for real sleep. But at 9 mao, Dad woke me up by turning on all the lights and saying I needed to study for tomorrow's science quiz. I'd mentioned it at dinner, and he'd decided that 2 hours of studying was mandatory. I tried to argue that I'd already studied during study hall, but he said, "You studied for algebra too, and look how that turned out. Get up, 2 hours, then you can sleep." I dragged myself to my desk and opened my science textbook while Dad sat on my bed supervising. Every time my eyes started to close, he'd snap his fingers and say, "Focus! You're not taking this seriously." At 11 Mai, he finally left, and I climbed back into bed, but I couldn't fall asleep. My mind was too wired from the forced studying, and I lay there staring at the ceiling until almost midnight. The next morning, I was so exhausted during the science quiz that I mixed up 2 concepts and scored an 86. That night, I slept on the floor again. The cycle continued for weeks. I'd earn my bed for a night or 2, then lose it again, when I inevitably scored below 90 on something. My body never fully recovered from the previous floor sleeping before I was back on the floor again. I developed constant headaches and started falling asleep during classes. My teachers noticed and sent emails to my parents expressing concern. Dad called me into his office, which was really just a corner of the basement he'd set up with a desk and filing cabinets. He showed me the emails and said, "Your teachers think you're sleep-deprived. Are you staying up too late? Are you on your phone at night?" I wanted to scream that I was sleeping on the floor because of his insane rules, but instead I said, "I'm just having trouble sleeping lately." Dad studied my face for a long moment, then said, "Maybe you need to see a doctor. Sleep problems can affect academic performance." The irony was crushing, but I just nodded. Mom made an appointment with our pediatrician, Dr. Simmons, for the following week. At the appointment, Dr. Simmons asked about my sleep habits, and with Mom sitting right there in the exam room, I said I'd been having trouble falling asleep and waking up sore. Dr. Simmons asked if I was sleeping in an uncomfortable position, and I said, maybe. She examined my spine and noted some minor misalignment that she said could be caused by poor posture or an unsupportive mattress. She recommended physical therapy and suggested we look into getting a better mattress. Mom nodded seriously and thanked her for the advice. In the car on the way home, Mom said, "See, your mattress might be the problem. We'll look into getting you a new one." I stared out the window and said nothing. The entire situation was so absurd, I wanted to laugh and cry at the same time. They were considering buying me a better mattress while simultaneously forcing me to sleep on the floor multiple times per week. Things got worse when report cards came out in November. I'd managed to maintain mostly A's and high B's, but I had an 88 in algebra and an 87 in science. Dad called a family meeting that night and made me stand in front of everyone while he explained how disappointed he was in my performance. Kara and Bree sat on the couch looking uncomfortable. Eli shifted in his chair. Dad said, "Your sisters and brother are all maintaining the standards we've set. Why can't you? What's different about you?" Mom added. We're not asking for the impossible. We're asking for effort and excellence. Is that too much? I stood there, with my fists clenched, wanting to say that their system was cruel and unreasonable, that sleeping on the floor made it harder to study and focus, that I was trying as hard as I could. But I'd learned that arguing only made things worse. So I said, I'll do better. Dad said, you'll do more than better. Until both those grades are up to at least a 90 average, you're sleeping on the floor every single night, no exceptions. That meant I'd be on the floor for weeks, possibly months, until I could bring both grades up through tests and assignments. I went to my room that night and looked at my bed, knowing I wouldn't be sleeping in it for a long time. I pulled out the thin blanket and pillow I was allowed for floor sleeping and made a small nest in the corner of my room. Eli came in later and whispered, I'm sorry. That's really unfair. I said, it's fine. I'll figure it out. But it wasn't fine, and I had no idea how to figure it out. Over the next 2 weeks, I studied constantly, barely sleeping even on the hard floor, trying desperately to improve my grades. I scored a 94 on an algebra quiz and a 91 on a science test. Progress, but not enough to change my overall averages yet. My body ached constantly. I had dark circles under my eyes. I started getting nosebleeds from stress and exhaustion. At school, I fell asleep during history class, and the teacher had to shake my shoulder to wake me up. She asked me to stay after class. Mrs. Fletcher was young, maybe late 20s, and she'd always been kind to me. She closed the classroom door and said, Jonah, I'm worried about you. You're clearly not getting enough sleep, and your performance has dropped significantly this semester. Is everything okay at home? I wanted to tell her everything, but fear stopped me. What if she called my parents? What if they denied it, and I got in trouble for lying? What if she reported it, and nothing changed, except my parents got angrier and made the rules stricter? So I said, I'm fine, just been staying up late studying. I'll do better. Mrs. Fletcher looked unconvinced. She said, You know I'm a mandatory reporter. If something's going on that's affecting your welfare, I have to report it. Are you in a safe environment? The question hung in the air between us. I thought about how to answer. Was I safe? My parents didn't hit me. They provided food and shelter. They weren't neglecting me. They were just strict about grades. Very strict. Unreasonably strict. But was that abuse? I said, I'm safe, I promise. Just stressed about school. Mrs. Fletcher nodded slowly but said, My door is always open if you need to talk. About anything. I thanked her and left, feeling both relieved and frustrated. Relieved that I hadn't had to explain the floor sleeping. Frustrated that I'd missed an opportunity for help. That afternoon, I scored an 89 on an English essay that I'd worked on for hours. The teacher had marked me down for weak thesis development, which was fair, but it meant another night on the floor. When I got home, Dad was waiting with the grade already pulled up on his laptop. He said, 89, almost passing, but not quite. You understand that almost doesn't count, right? Either you meet the standard or you don't. I nodded and went upstairs. Bree caught me in the hallway and whispered, I got a 96 on that same assignment. I can show you my essay if you want so you can see what she's looking for. I said, that would be cheating. Bree shook her head. Not cheating. Learning from an example. That's what good students do. She sent me her essay that night, and I read through it, noting how she'd structured her thesis and supporting arguments. It was brilliant. I tried to apply the same techniques to my own work. Over Thanksgiving break, while most families were relaxing and spending time together, Dad made me and Bree spend 6 hours each day studying. He said breaks were for students who'd earned them, and I hadn't earned anything with my current grades. Kara was away at a college visit trip, which was the only reason she escaped the forced study sessions. Eli had straight A's, so he got to watch TV and play video games while Bree and I sat at the dining room table with textbooks and practice problems. Dad checked our work every hour, and if he found mistakes, he'd make us redo the entire section. Mom brought us sandwiches for lunch and said, You'll thank us for this someday. When you're successful and accomplished, you'll remember that we pushed you to be your best. I ate my sandwich in silence and went back to studying. By the end of break, I'd worked ahead on 2 weeks of assignments and felt slightly more confident. But the exhaustion was becoming dangerous. I'd started having dizzy spells and trouble focusing my vision. The Monday after break, I fainted during gym class. 1 minute I was running laps, the next I was waking up on the floor with the gym teacher and school nurse crouched over me. They took me to the nurse's office and called my parents. Mom came to pick me up, and the nurse explained that I was severely exhausted and possibly dehydrated. She recommended rest and a follow-up with our doctor. In the car, Mom said, "You need to take better care of yourself. Fainting at school is embarrassing." I said, "I'm tired. I've been studying a lot." Mom said, "Studying is important, but you also need to maintain your health. Maybe you should go to bed earlier." I almost laughed. Go to bed earlier, on the floor, where I'd been sleeping for 3 weeks straight because my grades weren't good enough. That night, Dad said I could sleep in my bed as a medical exception, but starting tomorrow, the regular rules applied again. One night of decent sleep didn't undo weeks of floor sleeping, but I was grateful for it anyway. In early December, Mrs. Fletcher pulled me aside after class again. She said, "Jonah, I did some research after our last conversation. I found information about educational abuse and psychological maltreatment of children. Sometimes parents have expectations that are so extreme they actually harm their kids. I want you to read this." She handed me a printout of an article about pushy parents and the long-term effects on children's mental health. The article described kids who developed anxiety disorders, depression, and physical health problems from the pressure to achieve academically. It talked about parents who tied privileges to grades, who punished children for normal academic struggles, who created environments of constant stress. I read through it and felt like someone had written an article specifically about my family. Mrs. Fletcher said quietly, "If what I think is happening is actually happening, there are people who can help. School counselors, child protective services, family therapists. You don't have to live with unreasonable demands." I folded the paper and put it in my backpack. I said, "Thank you for caring. I'll think about it." That night, I looked up educational abuse on my phone. I found forums where kids described their parents' extreme academic pressure. One person wrote about how their parents took away all furniture except a desk and chair until grades improved. Another described having to exercise for every wrong answer on practice tests. Someone else wrote about parents who controlled all food based on test scores. The stories were horrifying, but they made me feel less alone. I wasn't the only kid whose parents had created insane systems of control disguised as high standards. I joined one of the forums using a fake name and posted, "My parents make me sleep on the floor if I score below 90 on tests or assignments. I've been on the floor for 3 weeks. Is this normal?" Within an hour, I had 10 responses, all saying some version of, "That's not normal, that's abuse. You need to tell someone." One person sent me links to Child Protective Services websites. Another person shared their story of reporting their parents and being placed with a relative. The responses were overwhelming. Maybe Mrs. Fletcher was right. Maybe this was something that could be reported. On Friday, I gathered my courage and went to the school counselor's office during lunch. The counselor, Mr. Diaz, was a friendly man in his 40s who'd always seemed approachable. I sat in the chair across from his desk and said, "I need to talk to you about something happening at home, but I'm scared of what will happen if I tell." Mr. Diaz leaned forward and said, "Whatever you share with me is confidential unless there's a safety concern. If you're being harmed or at risk of harm, I'm required to report it to the appropriate authorities. But I want to help you, so please tell me what's going on." I took a deep breath and explained the entire system. The floor sleeping tied to grades, the constant pressure, the physical problems I was having, the exhaustion, everything. Mr. Diaz listened without interrupting, his expression growing more concerned as I talked. When I finished, he said, "Jonah, what you're describing is a form of psychological abuse and possibly neglect. Forcing a child to sleep on the floor as punishment is not acceptable parenting. I'm going to have to file a report with Child Protective Services." My stomach dropped. I said, "What will happen?" Mr. Diaz explained that CPS would investigate, interview me and my siblings, visit our home, and assess whether we were in a safe environment. He said, "I know this is scary, but you need protection from this situation. You shouldn't have to earn basic comfort like a bed to sleep in. That's not how healthy families operate." I felt relief and terror in equal measure. Relief that someone was taking this seriously, terror about what my parents would do when they found out I'd reported them. Mr. Diaz said the report would be filed this afternoon and someone from CPS would probably contact me within a few days. He told me to come back anytime I needed to talk. I left his office feeling shaky, went to the bathroom, and cried for 10 minutes. I'd just set something in motion that I couldn't stop. That afternoon, I went home and acted normal, not mentioning anything about the counselor or the report. Dad asked about my day, and I said it was fine. At dinner, we ate in our usual tense silence, with Dad occasionally making comments about upcoming tests and assignments. 3 days later, on Monday afternoon, a CPS caseworker named Linda Maxwell came to our house for an announced visit. Dad let her in with a smile and friendly demeanor. She explained she was following up on concerns raised by the school about our family's approach to education and child well-being. Mom offered her coffee, and they all sat in the living room while I stood in the doorway. Linda asked me and my siblings to come sit down, and she started asking questions. First to Kara, asking about school and home life. Kara said everything was fine, that our parents had high expectations, but she appreciated the structure. Bree said similarly that our parents pushed us to excel, but it had helped her become a better student. Eli said he felt supported and encouraged. Then Linda turned to me. She asked, "Jonah, can you tell me about your sleeping arrangements?" Dad's expression didn't change, but his posture stiffened slightly. I glanced at him, then at Linda, and said, "I sleep in my room. I have a bed." Linda said, "Does anything about your sleeping situation ever change based on your school performance?" I could feel Dad's eyes boring into me. The threat was unspoken but clear. If I told the truth, there would be consequences. I hesitated, then said, "My dad wants me to improve my grades in algebra and science, so he's been motivating me to study harder." Linda wrote notes and asked, "What kind of motivation?" I said, "Just encouraging me to focus more." Linda looked at me for a long moment, and I knew she could tell I wasn't being completely honest. She turned to Dad and said, "Mr. Whitmore, the school report mentioned concerns about Jonah sleeping on the floor. Can you explain that?" Dad smiled and said, "Jonah has been going through a phase where he studies late and sometimes falls asleep at his desk or on the floor with his books. We've been trying to get him to maintain better sleep hygiene. The school must have misunderstood the situation." The lie was so smooth and confident that even I almost believed it. Linda asked if she could see our bedrooms, and Dad said, "Of course." She went upstairs with all of us following, and she looked in each room. My bed was perfectly made, sheets and blanket in place. Nothing indicating I'd been sleeping on the floor. My thin floor blanket and pillow were hidden in my closet. Linda asked me, "Do you sleep in this bed every night?" With Dad standing right there, I said, "Yes." She thanked us and went back downstairs to talk with my parents privately. I went to Eli's room and sat on his bed, feeling defeated. I'd just lied to a CPS worker who was trying to help me. Kara came in and said quietly, "You should have told the truth." I said, "Easy for you to say. You don't break the rules anymore." She left without responding. Linda spent another 20 minutes with my parents before leaving. After she was gone, Dad came upstairs and told all of us to meet in the living room. Once we were assembled, he said, "Someone at this table talked to the school about our family's private business. Someone made us sound like bad parents who abuse their children. I want to know who it was." Nobody spoke. Dad looked at each of us, and his eyes lingered on me. "Jonah, was it you?" I wanted to lie, but my face betrayed me. Dad nodded slowly. "I thought so. You went to the school counselor and made up stories about our family. Do you understand what could have happened? CPS could have taken all of you away. They could have put you in foster care where you'd actually experience real abuse. And for what? Because we have high standards? Because we expect excellence?" Mom added, "We're not monsters. We're trying to raise successful children. But you've decided to repay us by trying to destroy our family." I said, "I didn't make anything up. I told them the truth about the floor sleeping." Dad's face turned red. "The floor sleeping that you've earned through poor academic performance, that's not abuse, that's consequences. That's called parenting." The argument continued for another hour, my parents alternating between anger and lectures about loyalty and family privacy. Eventually, Dad said, Here's what's going to happen. The CPS case is closed because you lied and said everything was fine. You had your chance to tell the truth and you didn't. So we're going to continue as normal, except now you understand that if you try to involve outsiders again, the consequences will be worse. He explained that I was now on academic probation in our house. Not only did I have to maintain 90 or above on all assignments, but I also had to complete extra work to prove my commitment. 2 additional hours of studying every night, mandatory weekend study sessions, and daily progress reports showing improvement. If I complained or tried to get outside help again, they'd homeschool me, which would mean 24/7 supervision and even stricter control. I went to bed that night feeling hopeless. I'd tried to get help, and it had backfired completely. My situation was now worse than before, with additional requirements and the constant threat of homeschooling hanging over me. The next week, Mr. Diaz called me into his office and apologized. He said, "I'm sorry the CPS visit didn't result in more help for you. Sometimes the system fails kids who need protection, but I want you to know I'm still here and I'm still paying attention. If things get worse, please come back and tell me." I thanked him and left, but I'd already decided I wouldn't be going back to him for help. It was too risky, and it didn't work anyway. At home, Dad had implemented a new tracking system. Every night, I had to submit a spreadsheet showing all the work I'd completed that day, along with notes about what I'd learned. He'd review it and provide feedback, which usually meant pointing out everything I'd done wrong or inefficiently. The 2 extra hours of studying meant I was going to bed at 11:30 or midnight every night, still sleeping on the floor because my grades hadn't improved enough yet. I was running on 4 or 5 hours of sleep, and my body was breaking down. I started having stomach aches and headaches that wouldn't go away. My vision would blur during class. I'd space out during conversations because my brain couldn't process information anymore. In January, I got sick with what Dr. Simmons said was severe exhaustion and a weakened immune system. She prescribed rest and said I should stay home from school for at least 3 days. Mom picked up the prescription and took me home, but Dad said rest didn't mean no studying. He brought my textbooks to my room and said, "You're behind because of your illness. Use this time to catch up." I spent my sick days in bed, finally allowed to sleep there because I was medically unwell, but still having to complete assignments between naps. On the 3rd day, I was supposed to take a makeup algebra test online through the school portal. I logged in, saw the test questions, and felt my mind go completely blank. I couldn't remember anything. The formulas, the processes, the concepts I'd studied for dozens of hours just weren't there anymore. My brain had shut down from overload. I guessed on most of the questions and submitted the test, then logged off and went back to sleep. When the score posted later that day, I'd gotten a 72, the lowest score I'd ever received in my life. Dad found out within minutes of the score posting because he had alerts set up on his phone. He came into my room and said, 72. You scored a 72 on a makeup test that you had extra time to prepare for. This is unacceptable." I said, "I couldn't think straight. I was too tired." Dad said, "Tired is an excuse. Everyone gets tired. Successful people push through it." He left and came back with Mom, and they stood at the end of my bed explaining that my illness was no excuse for failure. They said I'd lost bed privileges indefinitely now, that even medical exceptions didn't apply anymore because I'd proven I couldn't be trusted to maintain standards even when given accommodations. Once I was healthy enough to be out of bed, I'd be back on the floor until I could demonstrate consistent excellence. I closed my eyes and wished I could disappear. The floor sleeping had started as occasional punishment, then became regular, and now was essentially permanent. I'd been on the floor more nights than in my bed over the past 4 months, and according to my parents, that was entirely my fault for not trying hard enough. When I went back to school the following week, Mrs. Fletcher noticed I'd lost weight and looked even more exhausted than before. She asked me to stay after class again, and this time she said, "I know you talked to Mr. Diaz and I know CPS came to your house. I also know nothing changed. I want you to understand something important. Just because the first attempt at getting help didn't work doesn't mean you should stop trying. Sometimes it takes multiple reports before the system responds. Sometimes you need documentation from multiple sources. I'm going to document my concerns about your welfare in my faculty records. If other teachers do the same, it builds a case." She paused. "I can't force you to report again, but I can be a witness to what I'm seeing. and what I'm seeing is a student who's being harmed by excessive pressure and inadequate care. I felt tears building up and blinked them back. I said, "Thank you. I just don't know what else to do." She said, "Keep track of everything. Write down dates and details of punishments, physical symptoms, anything that documents what's happening. If you decide to try again, having detailed records will help." I started keeping a journal hidden in my school locker. Every day I'd write down whether I'd slept on the floor or in my bed, what grades I'd received, what physical symptoms I was experiencing, and any relevant conversations with my parents. The entries were depressing to read back. Monday, slept on floor, scored 88 on history quiz. Dad said I wasn't taking it seriously. Back hurts constantly. Wednesday, slept on floor, scored 91 on English essay. Not enough to change overall average, still on floor, had dizzy spell during lunch. Friday, slept on floor, scored 89 on algebra test. Dad added extra hour of studying as punishment. The journal grew thicker as weeks passed, and I started to see patterns I hadn't noticed before. My grades were actually declining the more time I spent on the floor. The worse I slept, the worse I performed academically, which led to more floor sleeping, which led to worse performance. It was a cycle my parents had created but refused to acknowledge. When I tried to point this out to Dad one night, he said, "That's just proof you need to work harder. Other students deal with challenges and succeed anyway." In February, Kara had a breakdown at school. She'd been at the library studying until 2 hours in the morning when a teacher found her crying in the stacks. The teacher called our parents, and they had to go pick her up. At home, Kara locked herself in her bathroom and refused to come out for hours. I could hear Mom knocking and pleading with her to open the door. Finally, Kara emerged, and I heard her screaming at our parents for the first time in years. She said, "You've destroyed me. You've made me so terrified of failure that I can't function anymore. I have panic attacks before every test. I can't sleep. I can't eat. I can't enjoy anything because I'm always worried about grades. This isn't normal. This isn't love. This is torture." Dad tried to interrupt, but Kara kept going. "I got a full scholarship, and you think that proves your parenting works, but all it proves is that I learned to survive under constant threat. I don't want Jonah and Eli and Bree to end up like me. They're already showing signs of the same problems I have." Mom said, "Sweetie, you're just stressed. It's senior year. Everyone feels this way." Kara laughed bitterly. "No, Mom, not everyone feels this way. Normal kids don't develop anxiety disorders from their parents' expectations." The argument continued, and eventually Dad sent Kara to her room and told the rest of us to go to bed. But Kara's words stayed with me. She'd articulated everything I'd been feeling but couldn't express. This wasn't normal. This wasn't what other families did, and maybe, just maybe, if Kara was willing to say something, other people would start listening. The next day, Kara's English teacher called our parents concerned about her well-being based on an essay she'd written about academic pressure. Then Kara's college counselor called, expressing similar concerns. Suddenly, multiple school staff were paying attention to our family situation. Dad got defensive during the calls, insisting everything was fine and Kara was just stressed about college. But the calls kept coming. Teachers, counselors, administrators, all noting concerns. I watched this unfold and realized Mrs. Fletcher had been right. Multiple reports from multiple sources created a pattern that was harder to dismiss. I went back to Mr. Diaz and told him about Kara's breakdown, about my journal documenting the floor sleeping, about everything that had happened since the first CPS visit. He listened carefully and said, "I'm going to file another report, this time with more documentation." The second CPS visit happened 2 weeks later, and this time it was unannounced. Linda Maxwell showed up at our house on a Saturday morning when we were all home. Dad answered the door in sweatpants and a t-shirt, clearly not prepared for visitors. Linda said she had concerns based on new reports from the school and wanted to do another home assessment. This time, she asked to speak with each of us kids privately in separate rooms. She started with Kara, and I could hear them talking in hushed tones in Kara's bedroom. Then Bree, then Eli, then me. When Linda came to my room, she closed the door and said, "Jonah, I'm going to ask you some direct questions, and I need honest answers. Are you sleeping in your bed every night?" I looked at the floor, at the thin blanket and pillow that were currently visible because I'd slept there last night. I said, "No. I sleep on the floor when my grades fall below 90. I've been on the floor most nights for 4 months." Linda wrote notes and asked, "Do your parents know this causes you physical pain and affects your sleep?" I said, "Yes, but they say it's motivation to do better academically." Linda asked, "How often do you sleep on the floor?" I pulled out my phone and showed her the journal I'd been keeping. She read through the entries, her expression growing more serious with each page. Linda spent another hour at our house, photographing my room, the floor area where I slept, and interviewing my parents. When she left, she told my parents that she'd be recommending a follow-up investigation with a home safety assessment. Dad was furious after she left. He said, "You showed her your journal. You documented our private family matters and shared them with a government employee. Do you understand what you've done?" I said, "I showed her the truth." Dad said, "The truth as you see it, which is that you're a victim of your own poor choices. We don't force you to sleep on the floor. Your grades force you to sleep on the floor. There's a difference." Mom added, "If CPS takes you away from us, you'll end up in foster care with strangers who don't care about your future. Is that what you want?" I said, "I want to sleep in a bed. I want to not be exhausted all the time. I want parents who don't punish me for being human." The conversation ended with Dad sending me to my room, which meant the floor, since I'd scored an 86 on a science quiz that morning. The next week, a pediatric specialist appointed by CPS came to examine me. Dr. Ramirez was a woman in her 50s who specialized in cases of child abuse and neglect. She asked me to describe my symptoms, and I told her about the chronic back pain, the headaches, the exhaustion, the dizzy spells, the trouble concentrating. She did a physical exam and documented multiple issues: misalignment in my spine from sleeping on a hard surface, signs of chronic sleep deprivation including dark circles and slowed reflexes, and malnutrition from the stress affecting my appetite. She wrote up a report stating that my physical condition was consistent with ongoing inadequate sleeping arrangements and that I was at risk for long-term developmental problems if the situation continued. She recommended immediate intervention. Armed with this medical documentation plus the journal I'd been keeping plus reports from multiple teachers and counselors, CPS filed a petition with family court. My parents were ordered to appear at a hearing to address allegations of educational abuse and failure to provide adequate care. The hearing took place in March, 3 months after I'd first reported to Mr. Diaz. We all sat in a courtroom while a judge reviewed the evidence. My parents had hired a lawyer who argued that their parenting methods were strict but legal, that they provided food, shelter, and education, and that tying privileges to achievement was a common parenting strategy. The CPS lawyer countered that forcing a child to sleep on the floor for weeks at a time as punishment for academic performance constituted psychological abuse and neglect of basic needs. The judge listened to both sides, reviewed Dr. Ramirez's medical report, read excerpts from my journal, and heard testimony from Mrs. Fletcher and Mr. Diaz about the visible decline in my well-being. Then the judge asked to speak with me privately in her chambers. I sat across from Judge Sylvia Brennan, a stern-looking woman in her 60s, and she asked, "Jonah, if you could change one thing about your home life, what would it be?" I said, "I want to sleep in a bed every night without having to earn it. Sleep should be a basic right, not a reward." Judge Brennan nodded and asked, "Do you feel safe at home?" I said, "I'm not in danger of being hurt physically, but I'm exhausted all the time and I can't keep living this way." Judge Brennan made her ruling that afternoon. She ordered my parents to immediately cease all punishment involving sleep arrangements. She mandated that all children in the home would have access to their beds every night, regardless of academic performance. She ordered family therapy with a licensed counselor specializing in high-pressure parenting. She set up a monitoring system where a social worker would do monthly home visits for 6 months to ensure compliance. Violation of these orders would result in removal of the children from the home. My parents sat stone-faced as the judge explained that while she understood their desire to see their children succeed, their methods had crossed the line from strict parenting into harmful treatment. She said, "Your intentions may be good, but your execution has caused documented harm to your son. That ends today." Walking out of the courthouse, Dad wouldn't look at me. Mom cried quietly. Kara squeezed my hand and whispered, "You saved us." That night, I slept in my bed for the first time in weeks without having to earn it through grades. The relief was overwhelming, but so was the fear of what would come next. The court-ordered therapy sessions started the following week. Our therapist, Dr. Okafor, was a calm woman who specialized in family dynamics and educational pressure. The first session was tense, with my parents insisting they'd done nothing wrong and were being punished for having high standards. Dr. Okafor listened without judgment and then said, "Let's talk about the difference between high standards and harmful pressure. High standards involve clear expectations, support to meet those expectations, and understanding when children struggle. Harmful pressure involves punishment for normal academic challenges, tying basic needs to achievement, and creating an environment of constant fear. Based on what the court has shared with me, your family has crossed into harmful territory." She worked with my parents over multiple sessions, helping them understand how their own academic failures had led them to project impossible expectations onto us. She explained that their system had actually sabotaged our academic success by creating sleep deprivation and chronic stress that impaired our cognitive function. Slowly, painfully, things started to change at home. Dad stopped checking the school portal obsessively. Mom stopped making comments about the importance of grades during every conversation. The daily pressure lessened, though it didn't disappear entirely. My parents still valued academic achievement, but they began to understand that there were healthier ways to encourage it. I started sleeping better, which improved my focus at school, which actually improved my grades naturally, without the forced studying. By the end of the school year, I was maintaining solid B's and occasional A's without the constant terror of floor sleeping hanging over me. My back pain gradually improved. The headaches became less frequent. I started to remember what it felt like to just be a teenager instead of a perpetual student being evaluated for worthiness. Kara graduated and left for college, and before she left, she told me she was proud of me for speaking up when she'd been too scared to do it for years. She said our younger siblings would have better childhoods because I'd been brave enough to report. The social worker visits continued through the summer, and each time she confirmed that conditions were improving. My parents were complying with the court order, though I could tell they resented the oversight. The family therapy continued, and Dr. Okafor helped us work through years of dysfunction. She had individual sessions with each of us kids where we could talk about our experiences and feelings without our parents present. In one session, I told her I felt guilty for getting CPS involved because it felt like a betrayal of my family. Dr. Okafor said, "You didn't betray your family. You sought help for a harmful situation. That took tremendous courage, especially as a child with limited power. Your parents were the adults responsible for creating a safe home, and when they didn't, you had to advocate for yourself and your siblings. That's not betrayal. That's survival." Her words helped, but I still carried complicated feelings about everything that had happened. By September, when school started again, our family dynamic had shifted significantly. My parents were softer, less rigid, more willing to see us as individuals rather than academic projects. The terror and constant pressure were gone, replaced by something closer to normal parenting with reasonable expectations. Looking back now, 3 years later, I can see how close I came to a breaking point that might have caused permanent damage. The floor sleeping had been a symptom of a larger problem: my parents' inability to separate their own failures from their children's worth. They'd created a system where love was conditional on achievement, where comfort was earned rather than given, where we existed to validate their parenting rather than to develop into our own people. Breaking that system had taken months of documentation, multiple reports, court intervention, and ongoing therapy. But it had been worth it. My younger siblings were growing up with significantly less pressure. Bree was discovering interests outside of academics. Eli was playing sports and developing friendships. Kara was in therapy, working through her anxiety and learning that her worth wasn't tied to perfect grades. I was finding my own path, discovering that I was more than my test scores and that C's and B's didn't make me a failure. The beds in our house were finally just beds, not rewards to be earned through performance, but basic furniture that every child deserved to sleep in every single night. If you enjoyed this, you'll definitely want to see the next ones too. So subscribe now and let me know your take in the comments.